January 1945. The cold winds of the European winter bite through the air, freezing the bones of those who dare to endure it. Inside a stark gray POW camp, a group of women stand in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. Their faces are pale, their eyes haunted by months of hunger and exhaustion. They had once been soldiers, nurses, and civilians caught in the relentless tide of war, now reduced to mere captives of a brutal conflict they never chose. The guards, stern and unfeeling, give a harsh order. Cut your hair! No explanation, no mercy. The women are ushered to a grim corner of the camp, where a pair of crude scissors waits. As their long, once proud hair falls to the ground in ragged clumps, so too does their dignity, one strand at a time. The humiliation is palpable. A cruel, degrading act that serves to strip them not only of their appearance, but of their very identity. This was not a punishment for crime, but a calculated act of control, a reminder that in the eyes of the Allies, they were no longer women, but enemies to be broken. The soldiers watched silently, some with an air of indifference, others with cold satisfaction. But for the women, this was a moment of profound degradation, one that would linger long after the war's end. The year was 1945, and the Second World War had reached a critical juncture. By this time, Nazi Germany's empire was collapsing under the weight of Allied pressure. The war, which had already cost millions of lives, was beginning to wind down, but not before one last brutal winter on the European front. As the Allies pushed deeper into German-held territories, the world was coming to terms with the horrors of a war that would forever alter history. Germany, once the most powerful military force in Europe, was now being crushed from all sides. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, while American, British, and other Allied forces were closing in from the west. Major cities were falling one after another, and the Wehrmacht, stretched thin and demoralized, could no longer mount a serious defense. In the face of total defeat, the German leadership, still clinging to their ideology, unleashed desperate measures to defend their crumbling Reich. But in the rubble, the ordinary citizens, soldiers, and especially women, were left to bear the consequences of a war they had little control over. While the men fought on the front lines, many women found themselves in support roles. Thousands of women were conscripted into the auxiliary units of the German military, working in offices, factories, hospitals, and even combat positions. The Nazis, with their fervent nationalism, believed that women had a duty to support the war effort, and as the conflict escalated, the roles of women in the war deepened. The idea that women could be soldiers or resist the ideology of the Nazis was a foreign concept to many. But for those who did, whether by necessity or conviction, they became targets of both the enemy and their own nation's propaganda. By the time the Allies had reached German soil, tens of thousands of women had been swept into the war effort. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, had captured many of these women during their advance through occupied Europe. Most were not combatants, but workers or civilians swept up by the Nazi war machine. Yet, the prevailing sentiment among Allied forces was that these women were guilty by association, as supporters of the regime that had brought such destruction upon Europe. The treatment of these women as prisoners of war, POWs, varied widely from camp to camp. For many, it was the first time they had ever been captured, and they were subjected to the harsh realities of life as a POW under the Geneva Conventions. But the conventions did not necessarily shield them from humiliation or mistreatment. What made the situation more complex was the perception of German women. They were often viewed as collaborators, women who had supported or even actively participated in the Nazi cause. This stigma followed them into the prison camps, and it influenced how they were treated by the Allied soldiers who had taken them prisoner. In the larger context of the war, the Allies were determined to punish the German population as a whole. The concept of collective guilt took root as the atrocities of the Nazis were revealed. But the women caught in the middle of this wave of retribution were among the most vulnerable. Their fate was shaped not just by the war they were forced to live through, but by the gender-based stereotypes that dictated their worth in the eyes of the world. As the war drew to a close, the reality of life in the POW camps for these women became increasingly grim. While their male counterparts faced brutal conditions, women were often forced into even more degrading circumstances. For the women of the Third Reich, being captured meant facing an intense psychological battle, not just for survival, but for their very identity. With the fall of Nazi Germany, the victors imposed their own version of justice. It was a justice rooted in humiliation, in showing the German people, especially the women, that they were defeated, both physically and ideologically. It was in this climate of retribution that the order was given to cut the hair of German female POWs. This was not a random decision. The act of cutting a woman's hair had long been a symbol of stripping away her identity. It was a practice used throughout history as a means of humiliation, from ancient cultures to more recent wartime acts. For the Allies, particularly the British, the act was symbolic, a way to ensure that the German women felt the full weight of their defeat. But the haircutting was not just about removing their identity, it was also about control. In the chaos of the war's final months, with victory in sight, the Allies were focused on subjugating the enemy and ensuring that any vestiges of Nazi ideology were erased. The image of a woman with short, cropped hair, once a symbol of femininity and beauty, now became a reminder that these women were not to be seen as victims of war, but as perpetrators. The Allies did not see them as mothers, daughters, or sisters. They saw them only as part of the enemy. For many of these women, having their hair cut was one of the most profound moments of humiliation in their lives. The act itself was dehumanizing, robbing them of the one thing they could control in a world where everything else was taken from them. It was a moment that symbolized not just their defeat, but their total disempowerment. The psychological scars of this act would stay with them long after the war had ended, even as they returned to their homes, to their families, and to a broken Germany. The memories of that moment would remain. The sharp sting of cold scissors against their scalp, the feeling of their long hair falling to the ground, and the gaze of the soldiers who watched. The aftermath of the war would see millions of German women returning to a shattered homeland. The physical destruction of cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg reflecting the profound psychological and social devastation wrought upon the German population. For the women who had been POWs, the trauma they experienced went far beyond the loss of their homes or even the deprivation they faced in captivity. Their bodies were often the site of humiliation, their identities fractured by a world that now viewed them through a singular, damning lens. In the immediate post-war years, German women were forced to grapple with their roles in the war. For many of them, there was a bitter and cruel irony. They had been conscripted into the war effort, some willingly, others not, and had participated in various military and civilian capacities, often contributing to the machinery of war in ways they had little choice about. But once the war ended, they were seen as collaborators, enemies of the victorious Allies, and an embodiment of everything the Allies sought to punish. This stigmatization extended even to the women who had been captured as POWs. Despite the fact that many had been victims of circumstances, swept along by the tides of history rather than active perpetrators of Nazi crimes. The Allied forces, especially the British, were particularly harsh in their treatment of German female POWs. The policy was not simply one of detainment, it was one of punishment. There was a belief among many of the victors that these women had been complicit in the Nazi regime's atrocities, even if they had not directly participated in combat. This view was driven by a belief in collective guilt, where the entire German population, particularly those who had been in proximity to the Nazi government, was seen as equally responsible for the horrors perpetrated during the war. Thus, The humiliations faced by female prisoners were not about military strategy or necessity. They were rooted in a desire to demoralize and break them psychologically. The forced haircutting was part of this broader pattern of punishment. It was symbolic in nature, yet deeply personal. For the women, hair was not just a part of their appearance. It was tied to their identity and femininity. In a time when women's roles were often defined by their looks and domestic responsibilities, the act of forcibly cutting their hair was an assault on their very sense of self. It was a reminder that in this new world, they were no longer women of value. They were merely defeated enemies. The humiliation was not limited to the POW camps themselves. As the war ended, the act of cutting the hair of female Germans became a symbol of their subjugation, a visual marker that reinforced the idea that the women had been brought low, no longer standing as symbols of the Nazi ideal of Aryan purity and strength. Instead, they were reduced to prisoners, their once proud appearances shredded along with their dignity. But even as the war came to a close, the treatment of female POWs did not cease to be an issue. Some of the women who had suffered this indignity would later recount their experiences in interviews or written accounts, offering rare insights into what it was like to be on the receiving end of such a symbolic and traumatic act. The emotional toll was immense. Women who had once lived under the confident, if oppressive, regime of Nazi ideology now found themselves at the mercy of those who held the power to define their future. In the years following the war, many of these women returned to their homes, only to find that their return was met with suspicion. In post-war Germany, particularly in the areas occupied by the Allies, a complex and often hostile atmosphere prevailed. Women who had been POWs were often viewed with mistrust, even by other Germans. Many were seen as traitors or collaborators, stigmatized by their captivity and the belief that they had somehow contributed to the war effort. This deeply ingrained animosity would linger for decades, shaping the lives of many women who had done nothing more than survive the chaos of a war they could neither prevent nor escape. At the same time, the wider world was trying to come to terms with the enormity of the war's destruction. International attention focused on the military leaders and the highest-ranking officials responsible for the war crimes committed by the Nazis. But the women who had been humiliated in the POW camps, those who had their hair forcibly cut, were left behind in the shadows of history. Their experiences were buried beneath the narrative of male soldiers, generals, and political leaders. The trauma they faced was largely ignored in the larger post-war discourse. Yet, over time, a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. Historians, survivors, and advocates began to speak out about the psychological and emotional wounds left by the war, and the gendered nature of the violence that had been inflicted. For the women who had been forced to cut their hair, the act was a moment that would never fade, an enduring symbol of their humiliation. But it was also a moment that, over time, came to represent something more: the resilience of women caught in a war not of their making, who had survived in the face of overwhelming odds, and who, despite everything, were ultimately forgotten by the world that they had helped to shape. For the German women who were subjected to the humiliation of having their hair forcibly cut, the experience was far more than a simple act of punishment. It was a psychological blow, one that reached into the very core of their identities. Many of these women had been conscripted into roles they had little choice over, and yet, by the time they found themselves captured in POW camps, they had already endured the brutal toll of the war. The loss of their homes, their families, and their sense of safety had left scars that could never be fully erased. The moment their hair was cut, it represented the final stripping away of their dignity. For many, their hair had been an essential part of their identity. Long, flowing locks were a symbol of femininity, a cultural expression of beauty and youth. To have that taken from them in such a brutal and public manner was to be reduced to a mere shell, no longer recognizable as the women they once were. The humiliation of the act was compounded by the public nature of the punishment. It was done in front of their fellow POWs, and often in front of the very soldiers who had captured them. There was no opportunity for escape or hiding. The act was designed to degrade and dehumanize them in every possible way. Survivors of this experience, when later asked about it, spoke of the overwhelming sense of helplessness and fear that washed over them as they faced the cold scissors. Many described how their hair had been a constant in a world that had become unrecognizable, a small semblance of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic and violent life. The loss of it was symbolic, an erasure of everything they had known before the war. And for some, the emotional pain was deeper still. The shame and loss went beyond the physical. It was the moment they truly realized the full weight of their defeat. These women, forced into roles as combatants or war workers, were seen by their captors through a lens of collective guilt. They were part of a nation that had been responsible for some of the most horrific atrocities of the war. But what many did not understand or chose to ignore was that many of these women were not complicit in Nazi crimes. They had been swept up by circumstances beyond their control, and their participation in the war was driven by the demands of a totalitarian regime, not by their own ideology. Yet, their forced haircuts signified a wider collective judgment, that their mere association with the Nazi regime made them deserving of this public and dehumanizing punishment. From a tactical perspective, the act of cutting the hair of female POWs was not just about humiliation. It was a tool of psychological warfare. The Allies understood the power of image and symbolism, and what better way to break the spirit of an enemy than to strip away their identity? The hair of these women was more than just a physical feature. It was a symbol of their femininity, their strength, and, in the eyes of the Allied forces, their connection to the Nazi war machine. This practice was a deliberate attempt to reframe the identity of the women captured by the Allies. By forcing them to relinquish one of their most personal and visible traits, the Allies stripped them of their individuality, turning them into mere symbols of the enemy. This was not a strategy rooted in military necessity, but in psychological domination. It was a way to ensure that these women were no longer seen as human beings with their own stories and identities, but as faceless enemies, part of a collective group deserving of punishment. The tactical implications of such an act extended far beyond the immediate moment. The trauma of the forced haircut could last a lifetime, leaving emotional scars that would never fully heal. But it also sent a powerful message to other German women, and indeed to all who witnessed the act, that the Allies were in control, that they held the power to define what was acceptable and what was not. This was not just about defeating an enemy on the battlefield, it was about defeating their very sense of self. While the forced haircuts were a deeply personal and emotional act, they also reflect the broader conditions of POW camps during the final years of the war. These camps were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and under-resourced, creating a brutal environment for both male and female prisoners. The Allies, particularly the British, did adhere to some aspects of the Geneva Convention in terms of basic care and treatment, but the overall conditions were far from ideal. For women, the experience was especially difficult. While men could be seen as warriors, part of the expected military machinery, women were often reduced to secondary figures in the eyes of their captors. This led to a different kind of treatment, one that was more degrading and demoralizing. The women in these camps had few rights or protections. They were subject to the whims of their captors, who, as mentioned before, viewed them as symbols of the enemy rather than victims of war. Conditions in these camps were harsh. Food rations were minimal, and medical care was scarce. The mental toll was just as great, as many of the women found themselves in a world where their identities were often stripped from them. The forced haircut was merely the most visible sign of this treatment, a visual marker that emphasized their subjugation. The POW camps for women were often not well documented, especially compared to the more notorious camps for male prisoners. As a result, much of the suffering of these women has been overlooked in historical narratives. The forced haircut, though, stands as one of the clearest examples of how these women were made to feel powerless and inferior. The very act of having their hair cut symbolized the stripping of their identity, as well as the denial of their humanity. The decision to force German women POWs to cut their hair did not come from a single individual, but rather was a part of a broader approach to POW treatment. Allied leadership, particularly in the British Army, viewed German women in the context of collective responsibility. In their eyes, these women represented the enemy, and they needed to be treated as such. The decision to humiliate them in such a personal way was not made on a whim. It was part of a calculated effort to break the spirit of the enemy population and send a clear message about the consequences of supporting the Nazi regime. The rationale for the forced haircuts may have been rooted in military expediency and psychological warfare. But the decision to execute this act in such a public manner also had a moral and ethical component. Some within the Allied command may have seen it as a necessary form of retribution, while others might have justified it as a means of erasing any remnants of Nazi influence from the German population. But the impact on the women involved was profound, and the psychological consequences of this act are still felt by some to this day. The forced cutting of hair raises significant moral questions. Was it a justified punishment, given the context of war? Or was it a deeply unethical act, meant only to humiliate and degrade an already beaten enemy? The moral implications of such an act are complex, especially considering the already tragic circumstances in which these women found themselves. For many of the women who experienced it, the forced haircut was not a matter of punishment, but of humiliation. The psychological toll it took was immense, and for many it was a moment they would never forget. But beyond the personal level, the act also raises broader questions about the morality of treating captives as less than human. When does punishment cross the line into cruelty? And what does the act of humiliation say about the values of those who carry it out? The cutting of hair may have been intended as a way to break the spirits of the enemy, but in doing so, the Allies inadvertently engaged in a form of dehumanization. And for the women who were subjected to it, the trauma would remain long after the war ended, a painful reminder of the brutal realities of warfare. The forced haircuts of female POWs were not just a symbolic gesture. They also highlighted the changing roles of women in warfare, particularly during World War II. As the war progressed, women in Nazi Germany were increasingly drawn into roles that had traditionally been reserved for men. They became workers in war factories, nurses on the front lines, and even soldiers. The war blurred the lines of gender in ways never seen before, and as women became more integrated into the military-industrial complex, their contributions and presence in the war effort grew more significant. In Germany, the regime promoted women's involvement in supporting the war effort, particularly through the National Socialist Women's League and the German Red Cross, where women worked as nurses, clerks, and even in military positions such as the Helferinnen in the German army. However, the Nazi government had specific expectations of what roles women were meant to fill, essentially as supportive figures to men. Women soldiers were expected to maintain traditional gender roles while also participating in the military cause. However, many were conscripted into positions such as working in factories or providing logistical support for the military, roles that were critical to sustaining the war effort. For the Allies, the integration of women into the German war machine added to the complexity of their perception of German POWs. Women who were captured were often not regarded as regular civilians, but as active participants in the war effort, and this made them targets of harsh treatment. Many of the female prisoners had been conscripted into service, but their mere association with the Nazi regime was enough to earn them the label of enemy combatant. In Allied eyes, the woman who had worked in a factory or served as a nurse was just as much a part of the enemy as the soldiers on the front lines. This was further exacerbated by the broader perception of women during the war. The notion of the collaborator extended to all those caught in the gears of the Nazi regime, and German women, regardless of their individual roles, were often treated with contempt. While the physical conditions of the camps were deplorable for all prisoners, the women were uniquely vulnerable, and the trauma they faced was compounded by the aggressive manner in which they were viewed by their captors. The perception of the German woman during and after the war was shaped by wartime propaganda, which was designed to demonize the enemy. To the Allies, the German woman was a symbol of Nazi ideology, a co-conspirator in the regime's atrocities. But this perception ignored the complexities of individual lives and the differing reasons why women were involved in the war. Most were conscripted or had little choice but to participate. Yet the narrative of guilt by association prevailed. The symbolic act of cutting their hair represented not just a punishment, but an extension of the collective condemnation of the enemy. The idea of the German woman as both collaborator and victim merged into a singular image of the enemy who had to be punished. This approach reflected broader wartime attitudes, where any connection to the Nazi regime, whether by action or mere proximity, was enough to justify humiliation. The haircutting, as barbaric as it was, served a dual purpose: to strip away a symbol of femininity and to reinforce the Allies' portrayal of all German women as complicit in the war effort. Even those who had no direct involvement with the Nazi military were often painted with the same brush, suffering the consequences of being part of the larger German war machine. This collective guilt attached to German women made them easy targets for acts of dehumanization like the forced haircuts. It reflected not just a strategic move, but also an emotional one, as the Allied forces sought to express their anger and resentment at the suffering caused by the Nazi regime. At the heart of the forced haircuts lay the question of morality. Was it morally justifiable to humiliate women who were already victims of war, simply because of their association with an enemy regime? From a strictly military standpoint, the act could be seen as a way of stripping the enemy of their identity, a standard tactic in psychological warfare. But the ethical implications were far more complex. The forced haircutting was not just about punishing the women for their association with the enemy. It was about asserting dominance over a group that was already powerless. These women were not just combatants in the traditional sense, but human beings who had been caught in the crossfire of a devastating conflict. To reduce them to symbols of guilt, to strip them of their identity, was an act of profound cruelty. Yet, in the context of total war, morality often became secondary to retribution. It was the consequences of this cruelty, the emotional toll it took on the women, that would resonate long after the war's end. While the act of cutting hair may have been seen as an expression of wartime justice, it raises questions about the morality of collective punishment and the dehumanization of the enemy. How far can a society go in its treatment of prisoners before it crosses the line into cruelty? The Allied forces, in their desire to punish those associated with the Nazi regime, inadvertently perpetrated an act of humiliation and trauma on women who had already been victims of the war. In hindsight, the question remains whether the act of forced haircutting and the larger strategy of humiliation and subjugation achieved its intended effect. Did it break the spirit of these women? Or did it serve only to deepen the emotional scars of a war that had already taken so much from them? The leadership responsible for the decision to force women POWs to cut their hair was not a single individual, but a broader system of military leadership and command, structures that believed in using psychological tactics to demoralize the enemy. During wartime, especially in the final years of a protracted conflict, leaders are often forced to adopt harsh measures to break the will of their enemies. The decision to treat women in such a degrading manner stemmed from the larger wartime strategy of humiliation and punishment. The British and American military leadership, while focused on winning the war, also sought to impose symbolic acts of retribution that would resonate beyond the battlefield. The treatment of female prisoners, however, revealed the complexities of wartime leadership and how decisions made by military commanders could deeply affect individuals caught in the conflict. At the strategic level, leaders sought to demonstrate dominance, but they were also aware of the importance of moral authority. Yet, for some officers, the act of humiliating enemy women served as a clear message that the Allied forces would not tolerate any form of loyalty to the Nazi regime. Even though many of these women had no active role in the war's violence, they were nevertheless targeted because of their nationality and their perceived complicity. The leadership's decision to engage in this form of psychological warfare, including the forced haircut, was in line with the broader goals of breaking the spirit of the defeated enemy. However, it overlooked the potential long-term consequences for the women involved and their eventual reintegration into post-war society. The act of cutting the hair of female German POWs, though a calculated measure of psychological warfare, would come to symbolize the brutal reality of a world slowly moving toward the conclusion of a devastating global conflict. As the war dragged toward its final stages in 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany was becoming inevitable. Yet, in these last months of chaos, the Allies sought to not only win militarily, but to impose a moral victory over the enemy, one that was rooted in retribution and collective guilt. For many of the female prisoners in the camps, the moment their hair was forcibly cut marked a profound turning point. It was not just the loss of their physical appearance, but a stark representation of their dehumanization. Many of these women had already suffered years of torment and hardship, enduring bombing raids, starvation, and the trauma of being swept up in the machinery of a war that was larger than any of them. Some had been nurses or civilian workers, while others had found themselves in roles they never expected, such as the auxiliary soldiers of the Wehrmacht, or in other supporting capacities. The decision to treat them as combatants, to force them to lose their identity through the forced haircut, struck a deeper blow than many had expected. The moment was not isolated. Across multiple POW camps, the Allied forces continued to impose the same punishment on women they captured. They were ordered to remove their headscarves and stand before the guards, often in a crowded, cold, and impersonal environment where each woman was forced to submit to the scissors. The guards, who had once viewed these women as part of the enemy war effort, now saw them as objects to be controlled, their vulnerability exploited for the psychological satisfaction of the victors. The haircuts became a tool of domination. The women, once proud of their appearance, were reduced to the state of powerless prisoners. As their long locks were shaved off, it was not just their hair that was lost, but their very sense of self. What remained was not the individual, but a collective symbol of the enemy that needed to be obliterated. For the women, this act was one of humiliation and submission. There was no room for protest, no way to hide from the degradation. And yet, the internal strength these women carried would prove far greater than what the guards could have imagined. While the physical act of cutting their hair was an immediate form of punishment, its emotional impact would echo long after the war. For some, it served as a final act of humiliation. For others, it was an unwelcome reminder of the ways in which they were forced to survive. In the weeks that followed, many women, having faced this crushing blow to their dignity, would face even greater challenges, rebuilding their lives, reconciling with their own survival, and grappling with the trauma of being treated as subhuman. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, the final days of the war created a sense of urgency, and with it, the violence and harsh treatment of POWs reached its peak. In the closing months of 1945, with Germany in full retreat and Hitler's reign nearly at an end, the focus of the Allied military turned toward consolidating their victory. The forced haircuts were only one part of a much broader campaign to humiliate and break the spirit of the defeated enemy. Yet, it was an act that would leave lasting scars on those who endured it. For many of the women who had their hair cut, this was not the end of their suffering. While the war was nearing its conclusion, the psychological impact of this event continued to haunt them. For some, it was a bitter reminder of the war's toll on their identity, a mark that could never be erased. Women who had once been dignified and proud were now forced to carry the humiliation of that moment with them. This act of domination was not just about the momentary stripping of hair, but the long-lasting scars it left on their mental and emotional states. The aftermath of the war saw the Allied forces try to establish some form of order in a post-Nazi world. But for these women, the forced haircuts remained as one of the most vivid memories of their captivity. They were left to deal with the emotional wounds of their experiences, and many never fully recovered. The experience of humiliation, the loss of their identity, would color the way they viewed their place in the post-war world. Despite the brutal conditions in the camps, many of these women survived the war and returned home, only to find that they were still regarded with suspicion and scorn. Their forced participation in the Nazi war effort, real or perceived, had made them symbols of a regime that had brought untold suffering to Europe. For some, reintegrating into civilian life in post-war Germany was an arduous process, as they were forced to reckon with the trauma of war while being labeled as collaborators. But while the haircuts symbolized the humiliation these women faced during the war, they also became part of a larger story of survival. These women, whose lives were torn apart by the conflict, would later become the silent witnesses to a new world order that sought to understand and define what had happened in those dark years. The act of cutting their hair was not merely about breaking them. It was about erasing their past and reducing them to mere symbols of guilt. And yet, these women did not disappear. They endured, and in doing so, they reclaimed what had been taken from them: their dignity, their identities, and their voices. As the war ended and Europe moved toward recovery, the true cost of the conflict began to surface. The forced haircuts were but one small part of the broader suffering faced by women on all sides of the war. Yet, for those who had experienced them, they represented a dark chapter, one that would leave a mark on their generation, and one that would shape the way future generations would understand the role of women in wartime. It was not just a matter of losing their hair, but of losing a part of their very humanity, a wound that would take decades to heal. As the dust of war settled over a shattered Europe, the world began to turn its attention to rebuilding what had been lost, both physically and psychologically. In the case of the women who had endured the humiliation of having their hair forcibly cut in Allied POW camps, the war's aftermath presented a new, though no less difficult, struggle to recover from an experience that had left them deeply scarred, both inside and out. For many of these women, their trauma was compounded by the societal rejection they faced upon returning home. While much of the world focused on the grand politics of post-war Europe, the lives of these women, once soldiers, nurses, workers, and civilians, were relegated to the shadows. The forced haircutting, though it may seem a small act in the broader context of wartime brutality, became emblematic of a deeper, more pervasive system of humiliation that they endured. Many of these women were considered guilty by association, simply for being German, and even after the war, their roles in the Nazi machine, real or perceived, marked them as collaborators in the eyes of the world. Returning to their homes in a defeated Germany, they were met not with sympathy, but with suspicion and condemnation. Despite their victimization at the hands of Allied forces, these women were often branded as enemies. They were seen as part of the larger German war effort, complicit in the atrocities of the Nazi regime, even though many had been forced into service or conscripted into the war effort. The emotional cost of their captivity was profound. The forced haircut was not just a moment of humiliation in the camp, It became a symbol of their subjugation, a wound that could never be fully healed. While the physical toll of the war was evident, the mental and emotional scars carried by these women were invisible to most. They had been subjected to a war not of their choosing, and yet, when the conflict ended, the price they paid for their survival continued. For many, the forced haircut was just the beginning of a lifelong struggle with trauma, loss, and the stigma of being labeled a collaborator. Post-war Germany, struggling to rebuild, found little room for these women to grieve or to find solace. There was little recognition of their suffering or the deep psychological wounds they carried. Their place in the narrative of post-war recovery was uncertain as the country focused on its own rebuilding and reconciliation. Even within the families and communities they returned to, many of these women were treated with disdain, with their wartime roles and captivity continuing to haunt them. And yet, as the years passed, the memory of the forced haircuts, of the humiliation they endured, began to fade into the background of larger historical narratives. The focus shifted toward the men who had fought, who had led, and who had been at the forefront of the war effort. The female POWs, whose suffering had often been forgotten, were left to carry the weight of their experiences in silence. But despite the silence, the effects of these traumatic experiences were far from erased. The women who had been subjected to the forced haircuts and other humiliations of war carried their memories with them for the rest of their lives. Some would speak out in later years, recounting their experiences in interviews, books, or documentaries. For others, the memory of those moments, the cold scissors, the loss of their hair, the feeling of powerlessness, remained a silent, haunting presence that defined their post-war lives. While the official history of World War II often marginalized the experiences of women, a shift in historical understanding began to take place in the decades after the war. As the world moved into the 1960s and 1970s, there was a renewed focus on the experiences of women during wartime. Feminist movements, in particular, began to bring attention to the ways in which women had been affected by the war, both as victims and as participants in the broader conflicts. It was in this context that the stories of the women who had been humiliated by the forced haircuts began to gain more visibility. Yet even as their stories were slowly recognized, the psychological toll of the war lingered. The act of forced haircutting, in particular, was seen as a symbol of the ways in which wartime trauma could manifest in deeply personal and dehumanizing ways. The women who had been subjected to this treatment were not simply victims of an enemy army. They were survivors of an experience that stripped them of their dignity, leaving them with scars that would not heal. In the years after the war, many of these women would never fully recover from the trauma they had endured. They would return to their homes, to families who often did not understand the depth of their suffering, and would try to rebuild their lives in a society that had little room for the scars of war. The forced haircut, which had seemed like such a small act at the time, remained a potent symbol of their victimization. It was a visual reminder of the ways in which the war had stripped them of not only their identities, but their sense of self-worth. As history continued to unfold, the forced haircuts of female POWs became a symbol not just of wartime humiliation, but of the larger issues of gender, power, and identity. The act of cutting their hair was not just about breaking them in the moment. It was about imposing a narrative on their lives, one that would continue to haunt them long after the war ended. The consequences of this humiliation extended far beyond the camps and the immediate aftermath of the war. For many of these women, the psychological scars remained long after the physical ones had faded. The trauma of being stripped of their hair, of being publicly humiliated, and of being treated as enemies of the state left an indelible mark on their sense of identity. They had been caught in the crossfire of a war that they had not chosen, and yet they paid a heavy price for it. The scars of war are often invisible, and for the women who were humiliated by the forced haircuts, The legacy of this moment lived on in their hearts and minds. It was a cruel and degrading act, one that would define their lives in ways that no one could fully understand. But in the silence of their suffering, these women became the forgotten victims of a conflict that had reshaped the world. The forced haircuts of female German POWs are a poignant and painful reminder of the deeply dehumanizing nature of war. While history often focuses on the grand narratives of generals, battles, and political decisions, the personal stories of those who suffered in silence, particularly women, are often overshadowed. The women who endured the humiliation of having their hair forcibly cut were not just victims of wartime strategy, but of a broader social and moral mindset that sought to strip them of their identities, their dignity, and their humanity. In the aftermath of the war, these women faced not only the physical scars of their captivity, but the invisible wounds of psychological trauma that would endure long after the conflict ended. The loss of their hair was more than just an act of punishment. It symbolized the total erasure of their personhood, a deliberate effort to reduce them to mere symbols of the enemy. In doing so, the Allies inadvertently highlighted the complexity of the human condition during wartime, the way in which the lines between victim and perpetrator can blur, and the lasting impact that collective punishment has on individuals caught in the crossfire. The emotional scars of these women remain a quiet testament to the horrors of war, not just in the form of physical destruction, but in the deeply personal ways in which it affects those who are often forgotten. These women, whose lives were shaped by the cruel realities of conflict, have largely faded from the historical narrative. Yet their stories, their suffering, and their resilience are no less significant in the context of war's toll on humanity. In reflecting on this moment in history, we are reminded of the importance of recognizing the humanity of all individuals, regardless of their nationality or gender. The forced haircut, as degrading as it was, should serve as a symbol of the greater need to ensure that the voices and experiences of those often overlooked, especially women, are remembered and respected. The treatment of female POWs during and after World War II and the emotional scars they carried offers a sobering lesson about the consequences of wartime trauma and the enduring strength of those who, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, continue to survive. The forced haircuts may have stripped these women of their outward appearance, but they could never erase the inner strength and resilience that allowed them to endure, and in the years that followed, to reclaim their identities and dignity in the face of a world that had tried to deny them both. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their pain, but their perseverance and the enduring spirit of all those who have suffered the ravages of war.